My name is Sienna Mercer, and I am 27 years old, 1 week before my wedding. My future mother-in-law handed me a document at the dinner table and asked me to sign it before the ceremony, as a gift to the family, she said. Something simple to make everyone feel secure. I read it twice before I understood what it actually was. It was not a gift. It was a prenuptial waiver that would have transferred my entire inheritance from my grandfather, nearly $2 million held in a trust, directly into a joint family account controlled by my fiancé's parents. The moment we married, I looked up from the document. I looked at my fiancé, who would not meet my eyes, and I called off the wedding that same night. Before I tell you what happened after that, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop your city and the time where you are watching from. I read every comment. Let me take you back to the year I met Marcus and the family I thought I was joining. I met Marcus Calloway during my final year of graduate school. In a shared statistics course neither of us particularly wanted to be taking. He was charming in an easy, practiced way, the kind of charm that takes you a while to recognize as practiced rather than spontaneous. Because by the time you notice the pattern, you are already fond enough of him to dismiss the observation. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. A relationship that felt, for most of that time, genuinely good. He was attentive. He remembered details. He made an effort with my family that seemed sincere rather than performative. His parents, Richard and Diane Calloway, were a different matter entirely. Though it took me considerably longer to understand the shape of that difference than it probably should have. Richard ran a commercial real estate firm that had, by most outward appearances, done extremely well. Diane managed the household, and what seemed, the more time I spent around them, like an increasingly elaborate set of expectations about what marrying into their family actually required. I came from a quieter kind of family wealth, the kind that does not announce itself constantly. My grandfather, Walter Mercer, had built a successful manufacturing business over for decades, sold it 8 years before his death, and structured a trust for his 3 grandchildren that distributed fully at age 30. With partial access available earlier under specific circumstances, I was 27 when I met Marcus. The trust at that point held just under $2 million in my name, specifically, accumulated through careful, conservative investment over the years since my grandfather's passing. I did not discuss the specifics of this trust with Marcus until we had been together for roughly a year. Not out of secrecy exactly, but because the money had never felt like a defining part of who I was. I had grown up comfortable, but not extravagant, raised by parents who deliberately did not treat the eventual inheritance as something to organize a life around. When I did eventually mention it to Marcus, his reaction seemed appropriately measured. He asked a few questions, seemed neither overly interested nor dismissive, and the conversation moved on, the way conversations about money sometimes do between people who are not, at that point, thinking carefully about implications. I did not realize, at the time, that this conversation had traveled considerably further than the two of us. Diane began asking increasingly specific questions about the trust. Roughly 6 months into our engagement, the questions came disguised as ordinary interest, the kind of thing a future mother-in-law might reasonably ask: how the trust was structured, whether it would be considered separate property in a marriage, whether I had thought about estate planning for our eventual children. I answered honestly, at first, not recognizing the questions as anything other than the slightly intrusive curiosity that sometimes comes with merging to families. It was Richard who made the first comment. That should have alarmed me more than it did at the time. During a dinner roughly 8 months into our engagement, he mentioned, almost in passing, that families who truly intended to build a life together typically found ways to consolidate resources early. That separate accounts and separate trusts created a kind of, quote, division that worked against the spirit of marriage. I remember finding the comment slightly odd, slightly presumptuous, but not alarming enough at the time to raise directly with Marcus. I should have. I understand that clearly now. The wedding planning itself proceeded normally for most of the following year. Diane was, I want to be fair, genuinely helpful with certain logistics, venue coordination, vendor recommendations, the kind of practical assistance that made it easy to dismiss the earlier comments as simply an older generation's different way of thinking about marriage and money. Marcus, throughout this period, remained largely uninvolved in the financial discussions his parents were having with me. I assumed reasonably. I thought that this reflected a kind of deference to his parents' experience rather than any act of coordination on his part. I did not know, until considerably later, the actual extent of what had been discussed between Marcus and his parents during this period. Conversations that occurred entirely without my knowledge or presence. What I know now, pieced together after everything came apart, is that Richard's real estate firm had been experiencing significant financial difficulty for nearly 2 years. Difficulty that the family had worked hard to keep entirely private, even from people close to them. I want to walk through, specifically, the week leading up to the wedding, because the sequence of events matters considerably to understanding how deliberately this had been planned. 8 days before the ceremony, Diane invited me to what she described as a simple family dinner, just the four of us. A quiet moment before the chaos of the wedding weekend itself. The dinner began normally enough. Pleasant conversation about final wedding details, about the rehearsal schedule, about logistics that needed confirming. It was during dessert that Diane retrieved a manila folder from a side table and placed it in front of me, explaining that their family attorney had prepared a simple document, something many families do before a wedding. Just a formal way of expressing the family's intention to build shared financial security together. She said it casually. The way you describe something ordinary and unremarkable. The practiced casualness of someone who has rehearsed exactly how to present something they fully understand is not actually ordinary at all. I opened the folder. I began reading. The document was 11 pages, dense with legal language. The kind of document that takes considerable effort to fully parse in a single reading, particularly while sitting at a dinner table with 3 people watching you read it, but certain phrases were clear enough, even on a first pass, to understand the actual substance of what was being proposed. The document established what it called a unified family financial trust, into which my existing trust assets, specifically named, would transfer upon marriage. Control of this unified trust would rest with a board consisting of 3 people, Richard, Diane, and Marcus, holding what the document called a tie-breaking vote in the event of any disagreement. I read the relevant sections twice, needing to confirm I had actually understood what I believed I was understanding. The document, in plain terms, would transfer control of nearly $2 million from my grandfather's trust directly into accounts controlled primarily by my future in-laws. The moment Marcus and I were legally married, I looked up from the document. I asked, as evenly as I could manage, what exactly this document was actually for. Diane's response was practiced, the kind of explanation that had clearly been prepared in advance. She talked about family unity, about building shared security for the future, about how separate finances within a marriage create division that ultimately weakens the relationship. Richard added something about wanting to ensure the family's overall financial position remains strong, a comment that, looking back, was considerably more revealing than I understood it to be. In that moment, I turned to Marcus, who had said almost nothing throughout this entire exchange, and asked him directly whether he had known about this document before tonight. He did not answer immediately. He looked briefly at his parents, before looking back at me, and in that brief look, I understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once rather than gradually, that he had absolutely known that this conversation had been planned, rehearsed, and timed specifically for 1 week before our wedding, when the social and logistical pressure to simply proceed would presumably outweigh my willingness to seriously interrogate what I was being asked to sign. I asked him, directly, why this was happening 1 week before the wedding, rather than at any point during the previous 2 years we had been together. His answer, when it finally came, was quiet and considerably more honest than anything his parents had said throughout the entire dinner. He said his father's business had been struggling for nearly 2 years, that the difficulties were more severe than anyone outside the immediate family fully understood, that this document represented, essentially, a way of accessing capital that could stabilize the business before it collapsed entirely. He said he had known about the plan for several months. He said he had told himself it would be fine, that we would be married regardless, that the money was simply going to help his family through a difficult period, that I would understand eventually why this mattered so much to all of them. I asked him whether he had ever intended to tell me any of this honestly, at any point, rather than presenting it as a casual family tradition 1 week before our wedding. He did not have a good answer to that question. I do not think there actually was a good answer to that question. I did not sign the document that evening. I told them, as calmly as I could manage, given the circumstances, that I needed to think about everything I had just learned. And I left. I drove home, called my own attorney first thing the next morning, a woman named Patricia Renfrew, who had handled my grandfather's estate planning for years and understood the trust structure intimately. Patricia reviewed the document within hours and confirmed, in detail, exactly what I had already understood instinctively the previous night. The document would have transferred effective control of my entire inheritance to people who had no legal claim to it whatsoever, structured specifically to take effect automatically upon marriage, with provisions that would have made it extremely difficult to reverse. Afterward, she asked me, directly, whether Marcus had been aware of this plan before the dinner. I told her he had confirmed, that same evening, that he had known for several months. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that, in retrospect, crystallized everything I needed to understand about the situation. She said, "The document itself is concerning, certainly, but the fact that he knew and said nothing for months, that concerns me considerably more." I called Marcus that afternoon, one day after the dinner, 6 days before our scheduled wedding. I told him I was not signing the document, under any circumstances, and that I needed to understand, honestly, what our relationship actually was, if his family's financial crisis had been significant enough to make him willing to participate in a plan to take my inheritance without telling me directly. For months, he apologized extensively, the kind of apology that comes pouring out once someone realizes the consequences of their silence have finally caught up with them. He said he loved me, that the plan had never been about not loving me, that he had simply panicked about his family's situation and made a decision he now recognized was deeply wrong. I asked him one question that, more than anything else, determined what happened next. I asked him if I had signed that document at dinner without fully understanding it, without consulting an attorney. Would he have told me at any point afterward what it actually meant? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, honestly, that he did not know, that he had hoped somehow it would simply work out without ever requiring that conversation. That answer told me everything I needed to know. I called off the wedding the following day, 5 days before the ceremony, a decision that required canceling vendors, contacting nearly 200 guests, and absorbing financial losses on deposits that, given the timeline, were almost entirely non-refundable. My parents, when I told them everything, were initially shocked. Then, once they understood the full scope of what had been attempted, entirely supportive of the decision. My father specifically noting that he had always found something slightly performative about Richard's friendliness that he had never quite been able to articulate until now. Diane called me 3 times over the following week, each call increasingly desperate, asking whether there was any way to salvage the wedding, suggesting we could simply remove the document from consideration entirely and proceed as though it had never been presented. I told her, each time, that the document itself was not actually the core problem. The core problem was that her son had known, for months, about a plan to take control of my inheritance and had said nothing to me directly, choosing instead to let his family present it as a surprise 5 days before our wedding, fully expecting that social pressure and logistical momentum would simply carry me past any serious objection. I learned, several weeks later, through a mutual friend who still maintained contact with the Calloway family, that Richard's real estate firm had filed for a significant debt restructuring roughly 2 months after the canceled wedding, a development that suggested the financial difficulties had been considerably more severe than even Marcus had fully disclosed during our conversation. I do not know whether having access to my inheritance would have actually saved the business, or simply delayed an outcome that had already become largely inevitable given the underlying financial difficulties. I am genuinely not certain it matters which of those 2 possibilities was actually true. What matters, considerably more, is that I was asked to make an enormous, irreversible financial decision based on a document I was given less than an hour to consider, by people who had spent months planning the timing specifically to minimize my ability to seek outside counsel or seriously reconsider before being swept forward by the momentum of an already planned wedding. Marcus, has reached out twice in the months since the canceled wedding, both times expressing continued regret, both times suggesting that we might eventually find a way back to something resembling our previous relationship. I have told him, both times, that I do not think that is possible. Not because I do not believe his regret is genuine, but because I learned something fundamental about how he makes decisions under pressure. Something I do not believe simply disappears with an apology. However sincere that apology might actually be, I think often about the version of that week where I might have signed the document at dinner, swept along by social pressure and the simple momentum of an already planned wedding 5 days away. The version where I might have discovered the actual implications only months later. Once reversing the transfer had become legally and practically far more difficult than it would have been in that single moment of clarity at the dinner table. I am genuinely grateful, in a way that still surprises me when I examine it closely, that I happened to read carefully enough in that specific moment to understand what I was actually being asked to sign before momentum carried me past the opportunity to seriously question it. My grandfather's trust remains exactly where he structured it 8 years ago, controlled entirely by me, exactly as he intended when he built it. I think about him sometimes, about the careful, deliberate way he structured that trust specifically to protect against exactly this kind of situation, requiring my direct signature and consultation with independent counsel for any modification, a provision that, at the time he included it, I assumed was simply standard legal caution rather than something that would one day matter as significantly as it actually did. He used to tell me, when I was younger, that the people who deserved access to what he had built were the people who would never need to ask for it through pressure or manipulation. That genuine love does not require leveraging 190 to guests and a non-refundable venue deposit to extract financial control 5 days before a wedding. I did not fully understand what he meant until considerably later than I probably should have, but I understood it completely, with total clarity, the moment I finished reading that document at my future in-laws' dinner table, 1 week before a wedding that ultimately never happened. That is my story. If you have ever had to make a quick, difficult decision that ended up protecting something far more important than the immediate disappointment of the moment, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments, and if this story reminded you that genuine love never requires pressure, timing tricks, or financial leverage to prove itself, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. I will see you in the next one.